June 6, 1944. A stretch of Norman sand the planners had named Omaha. The tide is coming in fast, and the water at the edge of the beach is turning a color no one who saw it that morning ever forgot. Among the men pinned at the waterline is a private of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. His name is Carlton Barrett. He is 24 years old. He is small, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, the kind of build that in peacetime got a man overlooked. And on the most heavily defended beach in the history of amphibious warfare, he is doing something that seems to defy every instinct a human being has ever had about staying alive. He is walking, not once, not in a single desperate rush, but again and again, up and down the length of a beach swept, end to end by machine gun and mortar fire, carrying paper, carrying messages. His own Medal of Honor citation would later describe it in 6 plain words. He carried dispatches the length of the fire-swept beach. Think about what that sentence actually means. Around him, men with rifles are dying by the hundreds, cut down the instant they lift their heads to fire. The armed, the trained, the aggressive, the ones doing exactly what an infantry assault is supposed to do, are being killed in rows. And a small man carrying no weapon that matters, whose entire job is to move through that fire rather than shoot back at it, keeps crossing it and keeps living. He wades back into the surf to pull drowning men out of the water. He carries the wounded to a boat. He moves the length of the killing zone with folded paper, and the fire that is annihilating the rifleman does not stop him. Barrett was not unarmed in the sense that he carried nothing at all. Almost no soldier on that beach was. He was unarmed in the sense that mattered. His weapon could not help him do his job, and his job could not be done by shooting. He could not fight his way across that sand. No one could. The men trying to fight their way across it were the ones dying. His survival, and the survival of the messages he carried, depended on something the rifle had nothing to do with. And this is the strange, quiet paradox buried under the noise of the largest invasion ever launched. On a beach that killed armed men with terrible efficiency, one of the people who lived, and one of the reasons other people lived, was a messenger with nothing to fight with. That paradox is not an accident of one lucky man on one famous morning. It runs through the entire Second World War, wherever American soldiers fought, in a pattern so consistent that once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. The men who crossed fire carrying words, and not weapons, were doing one of the deadliest jobs in the army, and they were doing it precisely because the alternative had failed. To understand why, you have to understand what the messenger was actually for. By 1944, war was supposed to have made him obsolete. The whole point of 20th century military technology was to replace the man on foot with the voice on the wire and the signal in the air. An army that could talk to itself instantly, from the platoon in the hedgerow to the guns miles behind the line, did not need a human being to run through bullets with a scrap of paper. That was the promise, that was the theory. And across 4 years of combat, on beaches and in forests and on hilltops all over the world, that promise kept breaking at the worst possible moment, and when it broke, the oldest and least respected soldier in the army was the only thing left. The message had to get through. It was the first law of military communication, older than radio, older than the telegraph, older than the armies that fought this war. And in the moment the machines failed, the only way to keep that law was a man willing to carry the message himself. To see how often that moment came, you only have to look at how often American units found themselves cut off, surrounded, and suddenly deaf. It happened at Bastogne, in Belgium, in December of 1944, when the 101st Airborne Division was encircled during the Great German Offensive in the Ardennes. The most famous moment of that siege was itself a message. German officers walked into the American lines under a white flag, carrying a written demand for surrender, and the acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a reply of a single word: nuts. It is remembered as defiance, and it was. But strip away the legend, and you are left with the plain fact that even at the center of the most celebrated encirclement of the war, the decisive act was a message carried by hand between 2 armies. That division held Bastogne, but it paid a brutal price. In the span of the fighting from mid-December into early January, the 101st counted more than 340 men killed, over 1,600 wounded, and more than 500 missing. It happened in the Hurtgen forest on the German border in the autumn of 1944, in what became the longest single battle the United States Army has ever fought. There the enemy was partly the Germans and partly the forest itself. The trees grew so thick and so close that units lost sight of one another within a few yards. It was, in the words of those who studied it afterward, virtually impossible for units to stay in contact with one another, and squads and platoons vanished into the gloom and had to be found again by men sent to look for them. One division that went into that forest, the 28th Infantry Division, came out the other side, so shattered that some of its rifle companies had been reduced to a handful of men, and the division as a whole had taken more than 6,000 casualties in a matter of weeks. When the trees themselves break an army's ability to see and speak to itself, the burden of connection falls, once again, on the man willing to walk between the isolated pieces. And it happened in the mountains of eastern France, in the Vosges, in October of 1944, in one of the most famous rescues of the entire war. A battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas National Guard outfit, was surrounded by German forces on a wooded ridge and cut off from help. The men sent to break through to them were the Japanese-American soldiers of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, men whose own families were, in many cases, held in internment camps back home. They fought through days of savage close combat to reach the trapped Texans. On October 30, 1944, they broke through and reached the survivors, about 211 men out of an original strength closer to 275. The rescue is traditionally said to have cost the 442nd more than 800 casualties, though some historians now put the number closer to 400, all to bring out those 211 surrounded men. General George Marshall, the Army's Chief of Staff, is remembered as saying of those soldiers, simply, that they were superb. What every one of these episodes has in common is the same terrible arithmetic. A body of men, cut off, the wires severed, the radios failing, and survival hanging on whether contact could be restored. To be cut off was one of the specific terrors of infantry combat, and it was more than a problem of supply. A surrounded unit that could not communicate was an army in miniature that had lost its senses. It could not call for the artillery that was its greatest protector. It could not report what it saw, so the commanders behind it were blind exactly where they most needed to see. It could not coordinate a breakout or guide a rescue toward itself. It could not even be certain that anyone knew it was still alive. Men in that position have described the peculiar loneliness of it, the sense of the whole vast machine of the army going on somewhere beyond the ring of the enemy while they sat inside it, unheard. Restoring communication to such a unit was not a convenience. It was the difference between a formation that could still fight and a group of men simply waiting to be overrun. That is why the job of carrying the connection back to them was worth a man's life, and why men kept giving their lives to do it. So here is the question this account is going to answer. Why, in the most technologically advanced war the world had ever seen, did the survival of entire battalions keep coming down to whether one unarmed man could cross a field on foot? The obvious answers are all wrong. It was not because American commanders were careless with radios, or ignorant of technology, or nostalgic for an older kind of war. The United States Army that fought in 1944 was the most lavishly equipped fighting force on Earth, wired and radio-linked to a degree no other army came close to matching. It was not because the messengers were braver than everyone else, though many of them were extraordinarily brave. And it was not because the enemy was merciful, because the enemy was not. The real answer lies somewhere less romantic and far more interesting. It lies in a hard truth that the United States Army Signal Corps understood better than almost anyone in the world, and had built its entire doctrine around. The truth is this: every way an army has of talking to itself will fail. The wire will be cut, the radio will die, the signal will be swallowed by a hill or a forest or a dead battery. And an army that bets everything on any single one of them will, sooner or later, go deaf at the exact moment it can least afford to. The messenger existed because the machines were not trustworthy. And to see why a man on foot could be more reliable than a radio, you first have to take the radio seriously, because in 1944, it genuinely was a marvel. The American infantry radio of the Second World War was one of the quiet miracles of the entire conflict. For the first time in history, a foot soldier could carry a voice across the battlefield in a box on his own back. The smaller of the two main sets was the handy talkie, designated the SCR-536. It was a handheld radio, something a single man could operate while walking, weighing only about 5 pounds. A soldier switched it on simply by pulling out the antenna and switched it off by pushing the antenna back in. It used amplitude modulation, the older radio technology, and it held to a single fixed channel that had to be chosen before battle. Its range was short, often no more than a few hundred yards, and at best about a mile, which meant it was useful for a platoon talking to the company just behind it, and useless for anything farther. It first went into wide combat use in the Allied invasion of North Africa in November of 1942, and by the end of the war, well over 130,000 of them had been produced. Held in the hand, spoken into like a telephone, it looked like something out of the future to men whose fathers had fought the last war with flags and whistles and runners. The larger and more capable set was the SCR-300, the radio that gave the world the word walkie-talkie. This one a man wore on his back like a pack. Loaded with its battery, it weighed a little over 38 pounds. What made it remarkable was not its size, but its voice. It used frequency modulation, FM, the same fundamental technology that the American inventor Edwin Armstrong had pioneered to give radio a clarity that the older amplitude-modulated sets could never match. Frequency modulation shrugged off the crackle and hiss and the electrical noise of the battlefield, and it meant that a transmission came through clean and sharp, where an older set would have delivered a wash of static. The walkie-talkie ranged across dozens of channels, could reach out several miles under good conditions, and let a company on the move stay in constant spoken contact with the battalion behind it. Directing artillery, calling for support, reporting the enemy's position, all of it now traveled at the speed of a human voice instead of the speed of a running man. If accounts like this one matter to you, the human stories buried underneath the machinery of history, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of careful history reach the people who care about getting it right. Put those two radios together and lay them on top of the American genius for artillery, and you have the nervous system of the most responsive army in the world. Consider what it made possible. An American platoon leader looking at a tree line he could not see into no longer had to send a man forward to find out what was there and report back, a round trip that might take half an hour and cost that man his life. He could lift a handset and speak. And what answered him was not just his own platoon's rifles, but, potentially, the massed guns of an entire division. The American army had spent the lean years between the wars perfecting a system in which a single observer, with a single radio, could call for fire and have many separate batteries drop their shells onto one patch of ground at almost the same instant. The radio compressed time. It turned a question that used to take an hour into a question that took minutes, and it turned one man's eyes into the aiming point for dozens of guns. In open, favorable country, this was a devastating advantage, and the American army built its whole way of fighting around the assumption that its soldiers could always talk to one another and to their guns. That reach did not come from nowhere. Through the lean years between the two world wars, when the American army was small and starved of money, the officers of the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, in Oklahoma, had worked out a way of massing fire that no other army had matched. They built what they called a fire direction center, a single coordinating point that could take one observer's request and compute firing solutions for every gun within range at once. It meant that a lieutenant with a radio, looking at a single target, could bring down not just the 4 guns of his own battery, but the massed shells of an entire battalion, arriving together in a single crushing blow. The system was so effective that a single observer became, in a real sense, the most dangerous man on the battlefield, because his voice commanded the weight of dozens of guns. But every bit of that power flowed through the radio on his back. Cut the radio, and the most dangerous man on the battlefield became one more soldier with a pistol. The genius of American artillery and the fragility of American communication were the same fact seen from two sides. The guns were only ever as deadly as the voice that aimed them. And that assumption, that beautiful, powerful, war-winning assumption, was a trap. Because the radio, for all its brilliance, was fragile in ways that mattered most exactly when everything else was going wrong. The clean FM voice of the walkie-talkie depended on line of sight. Its signal traveled in something close to a straight line, which meant a ridge, a thick belt of forest, a deep sunken lane, or a stone town could simply block it. Put a hill between two radios, and they might as well have been on different continents. The set was only as alive as its battery, and the batteries did not last. A walkie-talkie's power supply might give roughly 40 hours of life, less in the cold, less when the set was worked hard, and in a surrounded unit that could not be resupplied. Every hour of transmission was an hour closer to silence. And the smaller handy talkie, for all its convenience, could reach barely a mile at the very best, and far less among trees or stone walls. Beyond that, it was a 5-pound paperweight. The radio was a voice that could be blocked by terrain, drained by time, and shattered by a single fragment of steel. The United States Army Signal Corps knew all of this. Its own official history would later admit, with unusual honesty, that when the war came, the Corps was, in its own words, the least prepared of all the Army's technical services for the sheer scale of what was about to be demanded of it. Demand for communication outran everything the peacetime planners had imagined, and out of that hard knowledge came a doctrine that would save thousands of lives, a doctrine built not on faith in the machine, but on suspicion of it. The principle was redundancy. Never rely on one channel. Lay telephone wire and set up radio and post visual signals and, always, keep messengers ready. Build every link in triplicate, because the battlefield will take at least 2 of the 3 away from you, and you cannot know in advance which 2. The wire was the backbone. Field telephone line offered something radio never could. It was clear, it was secure, and an enemy listening on the airwaves could not overhear it, because there was nothing on the air to overhear. Signal Corps soldiers strung thousands of miles of it, unspooling copper across fields and along hedgerows and through shattered towns, often under fire, so that command posts could speak to one another with the certainty of a telephone call. Switchboards tied the network together, and a whole craft grew up around keeping the lines alive. But wire had one catastrophic weakness. It was a physical thing, lying on the physical ground, and the ground in 1944 was being torn apart. Artillery cut it. Mortars cut it. Tank tracks ground it into the mud. A single shell could sever a battalion's voice in an instant, and then a soldier called a wireman had to go out along the line, under that same fire, and find the break and splice it back together. He had to walk or crawl the wire, sometimes for hundreds of yards, through exactly the bombardment that had cut it in the first place, feeling for the severed ends. It was among the deadliest routine jobs in the army, and it had to be done over and over, because the wire kept being cut over and over. Wire and radio were not the only backups the Signal Corps kept. At the message center of a headquarters, clerks logged every message in and out, and men stood ready to carry by hand whatever the machines could not. And beyond even the runner, there was a still older method that the modern army had not been too proud to keep. The Signal Corps maintained a pigeon service, thousands of trained birds that could carry a folded message clipped to a leg, back to their home loft, across country, that no wire reached, and no radio could penetrate. A pigeon could not be jammed, and did not need a battery, and when a patrol went out under orders of strict radio silence, a bird in a box might be the only way to send word home. It was 1944, the age of radar and the 4-engine bomber, and one of the United States Army's communication tools still had feathers. That was not backwardness. It was the same hard wisdom that kept the runner alive. Never trust a single channel. Keep a way to send a message that does not depend on electricity, or on wire, or on anything the enemy can switch off. The pigeon and the runner were cousins, the two oldest links in the chain, kept on the books precisely because the newest links were the ones most likely to fail. The scale of all this was staggering, and it is easy to forget how quickly it had been built. The Signal Corps had entered the 1930s as a small and underfunded branch of the Army, and by the height of the war, it had grown into a vast enterprise of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, laying field wire by the tens of thousands of miles, running switchboards and radio nets and message centers across every theater where American troops fought. It was, in effect, the sense organs and the nervous system of the entire army, assembled almost from nothing under the pressure of the war itself. But no matter how large it grew, the same truth held at the far end of every wire and every radio net. Sooner or later, the signal reached a place where the wire stopped, or the radio would not carry, or the enemy fire was too heavy for either to survive. And at that place, the whole immense apparatus came down to a single human being deciding whether to cross. Everything the Signal Corps built pointed, in the end, at the man on foot who finished the journey when the machines could not. So picture the situation that doctrine was built to survive, the moment when the whole elegant system comes apart at once. A unit is cut off. The wire to the rear has been shot through in a dozen places. The radio batteries are dying, and there is no way to bring up fresh ones. The one hill between the unit and its guns is blocking what signal the fading radios can still produce. The enemy is closing in. Every electronic voice the army spent a fortune to provide has gone silent, one after another, exactly as the Signal Corps warned it might. And in that silence, there is only one link left: a man. A man who can be handed a message, or told to memorize one, and sent out on his own 2 feet to carry the truth across ground that is killing everyone who moves. This was not a rare nightmare. This happened, in one form or another, on nearly every serious battlefield the American army fought on. And there is one hilltop in Normandy where it happened so completely and with such enormous consequences that it stands as the clearest proof of the whole argument. The place was Hill 314, above the town of Mortain in the French region of Normandy. The date was August of 1944, only 2 months after Omaha. The American breakout from the beachhead was finally rolling, the German front in the west was coming apart, and Adolf Hitler, against the urgent advice of his own field commanders, ordered a massive armored counterattack to stop it. The plan was to smash westward with panzer divisions, retake the town of Mortain, drive onto the coast at Avranches, and cut the advancing American army in 2. The Germans gave the operation a code name. Everything depended on speed and surprise. And standing squarely in its path, on the high bare hill that dominated the whole surrounding country, were roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, a division nicknamed Old Hickory. When the German attack crashed forward in the dark, it flowed around them and past them, and by morning they were surrounded, cut off. Alone on a hilltop, with panzer columns pouring through the valley below and on every side. What made that hill the single most important piece of ground in Normandy that week was its view. The crest rose more than 600 feet above the valley floor, and from it an observer could see for miles across the exact country the German tanks had to cross. And on the hill, trapped with the infantry, were 2 young forward observers of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, a first lieutenant named Charles Bartz, and a second lieutenant named Robert Weiss, who was just 21 years old. Weiss carried a radio set, an FM set called the SCR 610, roughly 35 pounds of equipment, with a range of about 5 miles, and through that radio, from the top of a surrounded hill, those 2 young men proceeded to conduct one of the most devastating artillery performances of the entire war. They could see the German armor moving in the valley. They called down fire on it. Battery after battery of American guns, miles to the rear, dropped their shells onto targets those two lieutenants picked out from the crest, converging fire from many guns onto one column at a time. The southern arm of Hitler's great counterattack was broken apart under a bombardment it could neither escape nor trace to its source, because the source was two men and a radio on a hill the Germans had failed to take. But here is the part of the story that matters most for our purpose. The radio that made all of that possible was dying. On a surrounded hill, there was no resupply. The batteries that fed the guns their targets were draining, hour by hour, and there was no way to bring more up the slope through the German ring. The telephone wire down the hill had been cut by shellfire. As the batteries weakened, the two lieutenants faced the exact silence the Signal Corps had spent a decade dreading. Their electronic voice, the voice killing German tanks by the dozen, was fading toward nothing, and the men on that hill fell back on the last redundancy: runners. Company commanders used men on foot to move information across the perimeter, to carry word of where the enemy was massing next, so that the little radio life that remained could be spent on the targets that mattered most, rather than wasted on routine. When the guns tried to resupply the hill by parachute, most of the drops drifted wide and fell into German hands. So the American gunners did something almost unbelievable. They took hollow smoke shells, the kind normally used to scatter propaganda leaflets over enemy lines, packed them instead with medical supplies, and fired those canisters gently onto the hilltop from miles away, a lifeline delivered by artillery. The men on the hill needed bandages and blood plasma. They also, just as desperately, needed batteries for their radios. For 6 days, from August 6th to August 12th, they held. The German drive stalled, and then collapsed under the fire the hill kept calling down, and the great counterattack meant to reach the sea died in the fields below. The German commanders understood exactly what had happened to them. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, tracing the failed advance on a map, is said to have put his finger on the town at the end of the road and remarked that this was where he would lose his reputation as a soldier. Hitler, unwilling to blame his own orders, declared that the attack had failed only because von Kluge had wanted it to fail. On the Allied side, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had grasped the opportunity as it unfolded, writing that, if only the Germans would keep attacking at Mortain for a few more days, they might never be able to get away at all. They were held there, and they did not get away cleanly, in large part because 700 men and 2 artillery observers refused to be driven off a hill. When relief finally broke through to Hill 314, the cost was staggering. Of the roughly 700 men who had been surrounded, only about 376 were able to walk off the hill when relief came. The battalion had lost some 277 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. 2 out of every 5 Americans on that hill had become a casualty. A National World War II museum describes the loss as over half of the men on the hilltop killed or wounded. Both young observers, Bartz and Weiss, received the Silver Star. 4 of the company commanders who held the perimeter and the senior surviving officer of the battalion received the Distinguished Service Cross. The battalion itself received the Presidential Unit Citation, and the decisive counterstroke of Hitler's summer had been broken by artillery directed from a hill that stayed connected to its guns by a fraying thread of radio and, when the radio began to fail, by men on foot. The 6 days on the hill were their own kind of ordeal, quite apart from the shelling. The men ran desperately short of water and of food. The wounded piled up with no way to evacuate them and little to treat them, which is why the plasma fired up in hollow shells mattered so much. And still the observers called their fire, and still the runners crossed the perimeter with word of the next German move. When it was over, the effect reached far beyond the hill. The counterattack that died at Mortain had been meant to split the American army in 2. Instead, its failure helped pull much of the German force in western France into a trap, the Great Pocket that closed around the town of Falaise in the days that followed, where an entire German army was shattered. A hilltop held by a deaf and dying battalion, kept barely connected to its guns, had helped decide the whole campaign for Normandy. Mortain is the whole argument in miniature, the most advanced communication technology in the world, performing brilliantly and then draining toward silence exactly when the stakes were highest, and being kept alive at the edges by the oldest method in the army. Which brings us to the pivot this entire account turns on. The messenger did not survive as an afterthought, a quaint holdover the modern army had not yet gotten around to eliminating. He survived because he could do the one thing no radio and no wire could do. He could not be jammed. He could not run out of battery. He could not be blocked by a hill or drowned out by static. He could choose his own path, hit the dirt when the shells came, wait out a burst, crawl the last 100 yards, and if the paper he carried was destroyed, he could still deliver the message out of his own memory. He was the one channel in the entire system that could think. The radio was faster when it worked. The man was more reliable when everything else had stopped working. And in war, reliability at the worst possible moment is worth more than speed on a good day. It is worth pausing on why a lone man on foot could live where a whole squad could not, because it was not simply a matter of courage or luck. A machine gun does not fire at a single point. It fires across a zone, a long, thin footprint of ground that its stream of bullets sweeps and rakes. To catch a target in that zone, the gunner needs it to be there long enough and large enough to be worth the burst. A squad of riflemen rushing a position is exactly that kind of target. The men bunch, they slow, they go to ground together, they present a mass that a gunner can traverse across and strike again and again. A single runner is the opposite kind of problem. He is one man, moving fast, choosing his own moment, dropping flat when the fire comes and rising when it lifts, gone from one patch of cover to the next before the gunner can settle on him. He does not have to defeat the machine gun. He only has to not be worth a burst in the instant he crosses. That is a chance a squad in the open assault never gets. And it is the whole reason the messenger could sometimes pass through fire that pinned everyone else to the earth. His unarmed, solitary swiftness was not a weakness. On that ground, it was the only thing that worked. This is the thing the popular memory of the war gets almost exactly backward. We remember the Second World War as the triumph of the machine, the tank and the bomber and the radio, and finally the bomb, and it was all of those things. But underneath the machines, holding them together at the seams, was the least glamorous soldier in the entire order of battle, the runner, the messenger. A job so old it predates gunpowder, a job that armies had been trying to abolish since the first field telephone was strung, and that stubbornly refused to die because the battlefield kept proving it necessary. The runner was not a new invention that the Second World War had dreamed up. He was the oldest communication soldier there was, and the generation that fought in 1944 had learned about him from their fathers, who had used runners constantly in the trenches of the First World War a quarter century before. In that earlier war, when artillery routinely blew apart the fragile telephone lines strung between the trenches and radio was still in its infancy, the runner was often the only way an order or a report could move at all, and the men who did it then knew exactly what kind of job it was. A veteran of that war, writing about it afterward, called the runner's job the hardest and most dangerous in the infantry, and said that for the man who did it, it was merely a question of how long he would last before he was wounded or killed. That was the reputation the job carried into the Second World War. Everyone understood what being a runner meant. The role was so universal that it reached into the strangest corners of the war. The man who ordered the doomed counterattack at Mortain, Adolf Hitler himself, had served in the First World War as a regimental message runner, one of the men who carried dispatches between headquarters and the forward trenches under fire. He had done, in his own youth, the same kind of job that Carlton Barrett would do on Omaha and that Herman Bender would die doing at Buna. Every army in both wars relied on runners, gave them a name, and spent them heavily, because every army eventually learned the same lesson about the limits of its machines. The messenger was not an American peculiarity. He was one of the few things common to every force on every side. What differed was how deliberately a given army planned for the day it would need him, and how tightly it wove him into everything else it did. The method had a brutal logic of its own. A runner was, by design, lightly equipped, carrying little more than a sidearm, a canteen, and a light pack, because his whole value was speed, and he could not afford the weight of a rifleman's load. He traded firepower for mobility, on purpose, because his task was to get somewhere, not to win a fight. An officer who sent a runner could not know the message had arrived until the runner came back, which is why important messages were often sent by 2 or 3 men along different routes, in the hope that at least one would get through. And a careful runner memorized his message before he left, word for word, so that if the paper was lost or soaked or torn away, the words would still arrive inside his head. He was a redundant system all by himself, the message written down and the message remembered, one man carrying 2 copies of the same truth across ground that was trying to kill him. And the runner was not some improvised volunteer grabbed at random when things fell apart. He was built into the very structure of the army. Every headquarters, from the platoon up through the company and the battalion, had men assigned to it as runners and messengers, a recognized duty with a recognized place in the organization. When an officer needed word carried and the wire was dead and the radio was silent, he did not have to wonder who would go. There were men whose job it already was. The army had looked clearly at the battlefield, understood that its finest electronics would routinely fail, and answered that certainty by writing the foot messenger permanently into its table of organization. The most modern army in the world kept, at its very heart, a role as old as war itself, and it kept it on purpose. To see what that job actually cost, and what it actually looked like, we have to leave the wide view and return to individual men, because the truth of this work lived in individual bodies moving across individual fields. Nowhere was that certainty proven faster than on Omaha Beach itself. The plan for the landing had assumed a web of radios tying the assault together, the infantry to the tanks, the beach to the ships, the forward troops to the naval guns waiting offshore to blast the German strongpoints apart. Within the first hour, much of that web was simply gone. Radios were swamped as men waded through water over their heads. Sets were clogged with sand and salt, dropped by men who were hit or smashed by fire before they ever reached dry ground. Whole units that were supposed to speak to the fleet found themselves unable to raise anyone at all. For long stretches of that morning, the ships offshore did not truly know what was happening on the sand in front of them, and the men on the sand could not tell them. Into that silence the burden fell exactly where the doctrine had always said it would, onto human beings. Onto men like John Pinder, going back into the surf again and again to drag working radios out of the water so the beach would have a voice at all. Onto men like Carlton Barrett, carrying by hand the messages that the drowned and shattered radios could no longer carry. The communications collapse on Omaha was not so much a failure of American planning as a violent confirmation of the very thing that planning had feared. And the answer to it, in those first hours, was the oldest answer there is. Return, first, to Carlton Barrett on the beach. What the citation compresses into a single line was, in reality, hours of a small man doing the arithmetic of survival over and over. Barrett had been born in 1919 in the town of Fulton, in the state of New York, and had joined the army in 1940, well before his country was in the war. On June 6, 1944, he came ashore near the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer as part of a beach party, one of the men whose job was to guide and mark and keep things moving on the sand. He waded in through water so deep it reached his neck, under fire from bluffs the Germans had spent years fortifying. To carry a dispatch the length of that beach was to solve, again and again, a problem that had no good solution. The beach was raked from end to end by machine guns, whose gunners needed only to swing a few degrees to sweep the whole strand. And Barrett moved through it anyway, not because he was armored or magically lucky, but because his task was pure movement, and a single man moving fast and low and alone presented a different kind of problem to a gunner than a clustered squad of riflemen trying to assault a strongpoint. He also, the citation records, returned to the surf again and again to drag floundering men out of water deep enough to drown them, carried the wounded to an evacuation craft, and, in words the army chose with care, arose as a leader in the stress of the occasion. He was not the highest-ranking man on that beach, or the most heavily armed, or the largest. He was a private who kept the messages moving when the men who were supposed to be fighting could not lift their heads, and he lived. Barrett survived the war. He stayed in the army for years, retired as a staff sergeant in 1963, and died in 1986 in California. His Medal of Honor rests today in a museum in Illinois. He is the rare case in this account, the messenger who crossed the fire and walked away from it. Most were not so fortunate. On the same beach, the same morning, in the neighboring 16th Infantry Regiment of the same 1st Division, another communications soldier was living out the darker and more common version of this story. His name was John Pinder. He was a technician 5th grade, a former minor league baseball pitcher from Pennsylvania, and June 6, 1944, was his 32nd birthday. Pinder was not a runner in the strict sense. He carried a radio, one of the vital sets that would let the men on the beach talk to the ships and the guns offshore. He struggled toward the sand through water up to his waist, holding that radio, and before he even reached dry land, the enemy fire found him and wounded him badly. He kept going. He delivered the radio. And then, instead of taking the cover that any reasonable man would have taken, he turned around and went back into the fire-swept surf, not once but on 3 separate occasions, to salvage more communications equipment from the water, because a unit with no radios was a unit that was deaf, and a deaf unit on that beach would die. On those trips he recovered vital parts and another working radio. He was wounded a second time. He helped get the beach communications running, and on the 3rd trip into that water he was hit again, and this time it killed him. He received the Medal of Honor. He had understood, and paid for the understanding with his life, the single truth this whole account is built on, that the message getting through was worth a man. Barrett and Pinder show the 2 faces of the same job on the same terrible morning, the messenger who lived and the communications man who died, both of them proving that when the electronic links faltered on Omaha, human beings filled the gap with their own bodies. But the purest example of the unarmed man crossing fire, the clearest case of a soldier whose hands were literally too full of the tools of communication to hold a weapon at all, did not happen in Europe. It happened on the other side of the world, in a fetid jungle in the Southwest Pacific, a year and a half before D-Day, and almost no one has ever heard of it. If this account is holding your attention, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means the next deep dive into the forgotten corners of this war will actually find you. These are the stories that almost never make it into the standard histories, and they only travel when people help them travel. The place was Buna, on the northern coast of New Guinea, and the time was Christmas of 1942. The men were soldiers of the 127th Infantry Regiment, part of the 32nd Infantry Division, a formation that had begun life as National Guardsmen from Wisconsin and Michigan, and was now fighting one of the most miserable campaigns of the entire war. Buna was heat, mud, disease, and a Japanese defense dug into bunkers so cunningly concealed that American soldiers died without ever seeing the men who killed them. Malaria and fever thinned the ranks nearly as fast as bullets did. And in the middle of that fighting, on Christmas Day, a rifle company was cut off from its battalion, its telephone line to the rear shot away, the unit isolated and unable to coordinate with anyone. A private first class named William Balzer, from a small town in Wisconsin, volunteered to fix that, not with a rifle, with a telephone wire. The plan was as simple and as suicidal as anything in this war. He would carry a communication line forward, across open ground under heavy Japanese fire, and physically connect the isolated company back to its battalion, restoring the voice that the enemy had severed. His weapon, for this task, was a spool of wire. He could not shoot and lay line at the same time. He was, in the only sense that counted, unarmed. Twice the fire drove him back. Twice he started again. And on the 3rd attempt, he went down onto his belly and crawled across that open field, dragging the wire behind him, until he reached the cut-off company and handed them back their connection to the rest of the army. He lived. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. Balzer lived, but the men around him doing the same job that same week mostly did not, and their names deserve to be said out loud. A sergeant of the same regiment named William Fail died performing a comparable act of communication under fire and received the Distinguished Service Cross after his death. Another soldier of the regiment, a private named Gordon Eoff, earned the same decoration for his own effort to keep the units linked. And a week later, on the last day of 1942, a private first class named Herman Bender from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, 21 years old, was ordered to establish contact between two American forces that had lost touch with each other. To do it, he had to cross about 200 yards of open ground in full view of the enemy, with no way to fight and no cover to hide behind. He crossed it. He reached the other force and got the information that was needed. And then, already mortally wounded, he turned around and dragged himself back across that same 200 yards of killing ground, refusing to die until he had delivered his report. He made it back. He gave his report. Then he was gone. He too received the Distinguished Service Cross, and he was 21 years old. Look at what these men have in common, because it is the shape of the whole pattern. Each of them was handed a task that could only be accomplished by crossing fire on foot. Each of them was, for the duration of that task, effectively without a weapon, because their hands and their attention were consumed by the work of restoring communication. Each of them faced fire that was killing armed men freely, and in each case, the survival or the coordination of an entire body of troops depended not on firepower, but on whether one man could get across a patch of open ground. Balzer got across and lived. Bender got the connection made and died of it. Fale died the day after Christmas doing the same thing. The message got through. The men who carried it did not always come back. Now stand back and look at the whole picture, because a genuine verdict is possible here, and it is more interesting than simple heroism. There were, in effect, two competing theories of how an army should keep itself connected in battle, and the Second World War tested both of them to destruction. The first theory was the theory of the machine. Build the finest radios and the most extensive wire networks in the world. Put a voice in every soldier's reach, and let electrons carry the army's thoughts at the speed of light. This theory was correct, and it was magnificent, and on a good day, it made the American army the most responsive fighting force on the planet. The second theory was quieter and far older and far less glamorous. It said, simply, that every machine will fail, and that the only communication you can truly count on in the end is a human being who can be sent, on foot, to carry the truth by hand. This theory was also correct. The genius of American communications doctrine, and the thing that set it apart, was that it refused to choose between them. It did not bet everything on the radio, the way a purely modern mind would have wanted to. It kept the runner. It built the most advanced electronic communication system any army had ever fielded, and then, underneath it, it deliberately preserved the most primitive one, precisely because it understood that the advanced system would betray it at the worst possible moment. The radio was the answer to the question, how do we talk to each other quickly? The messenger was the answer to a different and deeper question, the one the machine could not answer. What do we do when the machine stops? Other armies leaned on their radios just as heavily, and no army escaped the fundamental fragility of the electronic link. The difference lay in how completely you prepared for its failure, and the American army, taught by a signal corps that had honestly measured its own unreadiness before the war, prepared for that failure by keeping alive the one link that could not be switched off from the outside. A man who had decided the message would get through. That is the forensic truth underneath all of these stories. Carlton Barrett did not survive Omaha because the radio failed him. He survived because the American army had decided, long before June of 1944, that on a beach where radios would drown and wires would be cut and whole units would go deaf in the surf, there had to be men whose entire purpose was to keep the words moving by hand. Robert Weiss held Hill 314 with a radio until the batteries began to die, and then the hill was held at the edges by runners because the doctrine had planned for the batteries to die. William Balzer crawled across an open field with a spool of wire because the theory of the machine had a hole in it exactly the shape of a cut telephone line, and the only thing that could fill that hole was a human being willing to become the connection himself. None of these men were failures of technology. They were the deliberate, designed answer to the certainty that technology fails. And so we come back to the small man on the beach. and to the strange thing that seemed, at the start, to defy every instinct about survival. The sight of Carlton Barrett walking the length of Omaha with paper in his hands, while armed men died around him, is not, in the end, a paradox at all. It is the visible surface of a decision the army had made years before, a decision that the message getting through was worth building a whole redundant human channel to protect, down to the level of a single private who could be sent into the fire carrying nothing but words. He carried no weapon that could save him. That was never the point. His value was not in what he could destroy, but in what he could connect, and connection, on a battlefield where every wire and every radio was under sentence of death, was the thing that kept whole units alive. The machines of that war have all been retired now, the handy-talkie and the walkie-talkie sitting silent behind museum glass, curiosities from a vanished age. The men who carried them, and the men who carried paper when the machines went silent, have almost all followed. But the truth they proved on that sand, and on that hill, and in that jungle, did not retire with them. An army, like any living thing, is only as alive as its ability to feel itself, to send a signal from one part of the body to another and know that it arrived. Build that ability out of wire and it can be cut. Build it out of radio waves and it can be blocked or silenced or drained. Build it, in the end, out of a human being who has decided to cross the fire, and it becomes something that can be killed but never quite switched off. Carlton Barrett walked the length of the deadliest beach in history carrying words, and he lived, and the words lived with him. That was not luck. That was the last and oldest link in the chain, doing the one thing it had been kept alive to do. The message got through, because a man carried it. In the end, that is what a messenger was. Not a soldier who had failed to find a better weapon, but the proof that some things are too important to trust to a machine. If this account gave you something to carry with you, something worth remembering about the men history left in its footnotes, hit the like button and subscribe. It is how these stories reach the people who still care about getting the history right.